Hello, everyone, and welcome to Father Figure Tales, where I take great pleasure in sharing stories of all sorts with you, whether it be for bedtime or simply relaxing. Tonight, we take a look at The Inn by Guy de Maupassant. Resembling in appearance all the wooden hostelries of the high Alps situated at the foot of glaciers in the barren rocky gorges that intersect the summits of the mountains, the Inn of Schwarenbach serves as a resting place for travelers crossing the Gemini Pass. It remains open for 6 months in the year and is inhabited by the family of Jean Hauser. Then, as soon as the snow begins to fall and to fill the valley so as to make the road down to Loki impassable, the father and his three sons go away and leave the house in charge of the old guide, Gaspard Harry, the young guide, Ulrich Kunzi, and Sam, the great mountain dog. The two men and the dog remain till the spring in their snowy prison, with nothing before their eyes except the immense white slopes of the Balmhorn, surrounded by light, glistening summits, and are shut in, locked up, and buried by the snow which rises around them, and which envelops, binds, and crushes the little house, which lies piled on the roof, covering the windows and blocking up the door. It was the day on which the Hauser family were going to return to Loki, as winter was approaching and the descent was becoming dangerous. Three mules started first, laden with baggage and led by the three sons. Then the mother, Jean Hauser, and her daughter, Louise, mounted a fourth mule and set off in their turn, and the father followed them, accompanied by the two men in charge, who were to escort the family as far as the brow of the descent. First of all, they passed the round but small lake, which was now frozen over, at the bottom of the mass of rocks which stretched in front of the inn, and then they followed the valley, which was dominated on all sides by the snow-covered summits. A ray of sunlight fell into that little white, glistening, frozen desert and illuminated it with a cold and dazzling flame. No living thing appeared among this ocean of mountains. There was no motion, this immeasurable solitude, and no noise disturbed the profound silence. By degrees, the young guide, Ulrich Kunzi, tall, long-legged Swiss, left old man Hauser and old Gaspard behind in order to catch up the mule which bore the two women. The younger one looked at him as he approached and appeared to be calling him with her sad eyes. She was a young, fair-haired little peasant girl whose milk-white cheeks and pale hair looked as if they had lost their color by their long abode in the ice. When he had got up to the animal she was riding, he put his hand on the crupper and relaxed his speed. Mother Hauser began to talk to him, enumerating with the minutest details all that he would have to attend to during the winter. It was the first time that he was going to stay up there, while old Harry had already spent 14 winters amid the snow at the end of Schwarenbach. Ulrich Kunzi listened without appearing to understand, and looked incessantly at the girl. From time to time he replied, "Yes, Madame Hauser," but his thoughts seemed far away, and his calm features remained unmoved. They reached Lake Dobie, whose broad, frozen surface extended to the end of the valley. On the right one saw the black, pointed, rocky summits of the Dobenhorn beside the enormous moraines of the Lommern Glacier, above which rose the wild Strubel. As they approached the Gemmi Pass, where the descent of Lochi begins, they suddenly beheld the immense horizon of the Alps of the Valais, from which the broad, deep valley of the Rhone separated them. At the distance, there was a group of white, unequal, flat, or pointed mountain summits which glistened in the sun. The Mischabel, with its two peaks, the huge group of the Weisshorn, the heavy Brunegorn, the lofty and formidable pyramid of Mount Cervin, that slayer of men, the Dent Blanche, that monstrous coquette. Then beneath them, in a tremendous hole, at the bottom of a terrific abyss, they perceived Lochi, where houses looked as grains of sand which had been thrown into that enormous crevice that is ended and closed by the Gemmi, which opens down below on the Rhone. The mule stopped at the edge of the path, which winds and turns continually, doubling backward, then, fantastically and strangely, the side of the mountain as far as the almost invisible little village at its feet. Women jumped into the snow, the two old men joined them. Well, Father Hauser said, goodbye and keep up your spirits till next year, my friends. And old Harry replied, till next year. They embraced each other, and then Madame Hauser, in her turn, offered her cheek, and the girl did the same. When Ulrich Kunzi's turn came, he whispered in Louise's ear, do not forget those up yonder. She replied no, in such a low voice that he guessed what she had said without hearing it. Well, adieu, Queen Hauser repeated, and don't fall ill. Going before the two women, he commenced the descent, and soon all three disappeared at the first turn in the road, while the two men returned to the inn at Schwarenbach. They walked slowly, side by side, without speaking. It was over, and they would be alone together for 4 or 5 months. Then, Gaspard Harry began to relate his life last winter. He had remained with Michael Canol, was too old now to stand it, or an accident might happen during that long solitude. They had not been dull, however. The only thing was to make up one's mind to it from the first, and in the end would one find plenty of distraction, games, and other means of whiling away the time. Ulrich Kunzi listened to him with his eyes on the ground, for in his thoughts he was following those who were descending to the village. He soon came in sight of the inn, which was, however, scarcely visible, so small did it look, black speck at the foot of that enormous billow of snow. When they opened the door, Sam, the grey curly dog, began to romp round them. My boy, old Gaspard said, we have no women now, so we must get our own dinner ready. Go and peel the potatoes. And they both sat down on wooden stools and began to prepare the soup. The next morning seemed very long to Kunzi. Old Harry smoked and spat on the hearth, while the young man looked out of the window at the snow-covered mountain opposite the house. In the afternoon he went out, going over yesterday's ground again, looked for the traces of the mule that had carried the two women. Then, when he reached the Gemai Pass, he laid himself down on his stomach and looked at Loki. The village, in its rocky pit, was not yet buried under the snow, but it was sheltered by the pine woods which protected it on all sides. Its low houses looked like paving stones in a large meadow from above. Hauser's little daughter was there now, one of those gray-colored houses, which Ulrich Kunzi was too far away to be able to make them out separately. How he would have liked to go down while he was yet able. But the sun has disappeared behind the lofty crest of the Wildstrubel. The young man returned to the chalet. Daddy Harry was smoking. When he saw his mate come in, he proposed a game of cards to him. They sat down opposite each other, either side of the table. They played for a long time, a simple game called Brisk. And then they had supper and went to bed. Following days were like the first, bright and cold, without any fresh snow. Old Gaspard spent his afternoons in watching the eagles and other rare birds which ventured on those frozen heights, while Ulrich turned regularly to the Gemai Pass to look at the village. Then they played cards, dice, or dominoes, and lost and won a trifle just to create an interest in the game. One morning Harry, who was up first, called his companion. Moving, deep and light cloud of white spray was falling on them noiselessly, and was by degrees burying them under a thick, heavy coverlay of foam. That lasted 4 days and 4 nights. It was necessary to free the door and the windows, to dig out a passage and to cut steps to get over this frozen powder. The 12 hours frost had made it hard as the granite of the mountains. They lived like prisoners and did not venture outside their abode. They had divided their duties. They performed regularly. Ulrich Kunzi undertook the scouring, washing, and everything that belonged to cleanliness. He also chopped up the wood. Gaspard Harry did the cooking and attended to the fire. Their regular and monotonous work was interrupted by long games at cards or dice, and they never quarreled, always calm and placid. They were never seen impatient or ill-humored, nor did they ever use hard words. where they had laid in a stock of patience for their wintering on the top of the mountain. Sometimes, old Gasper took his rifle and went after chamois. Occasionally, he killed one. Then, there was a feast in the inn of Schwarenbach, and they reveled in fresh meat. One morning, he went out as usual. The thermometer outside marked 18 degrees of frost. As the sun had not yet risen, the hunter hoped to surprise the animals at the approaches of the wild troop, and Ulrich, being alone, remained in bed until 10 o'clock. He was of a sleepy nature. He would not have dared to give way like that to his inclination in the presence of the old guide, who was ever an early riser. He breakfasted leisurely with Sam, who also spent his days and nights in sleeping in front of the fire. Then he felt low-spirited, even frightened at solitude, seized by a longing for his daily game of cards, as one is by the craving of a confirmed habit. So he went out to meet his companion, who was return at 4 o'clock. Snow had leveled the whole deep valley, filled up the crevices, obliterated all signs of the two lakes, and covered the rocks. But between the high summits there was nothing but an immense, white, regular, dazzling and frozen surface. 3 weeks Ulrich had not been to the edge of the precipice from which he had looked down on the village, and he wanted to go there before climbing the slopes which led to Wildstrup. Loki was now also covered by the snow. The houses could scarcely be distinguished, covered as they were by that white cloak. Then, turning to the right, he reached the Lommern Glacier, went along with the mountaineer's long strides, striking the snow. It was as hard as a rock. With his iron-pointed stick, with his piercing eyes, he looked for the little black moving speck in the distance, that enormous white expanse. When he reached the end of the glacier, he stopped and asked himself whether the old man had taken the road, and then began to walk along the moraines with rapid and uneasy steps. The day was declining. The snow was assuming a rosy tint, and a dry, frozen wind blew in rough gusts over its crystal surface. Ulrich uttered a long, shrill, vibrating call. Its voice sped through the death-like silence in which the mountains were sleeping. It reached the distance across profound and motionless waves of glacial foam, the cry of a bird, across the waves of the sea. Then it died away and nothing answered him. He began to walk again. The sun had sunk yonder behind the mountain tops, were still purple with the reflection from the sky. The depths of the valley were becoming gray. Suddenly the young man felt frightened. It seemed to him as if the silence, cold, solitude, winter death of these mountains were taking possession of him, were going to stop and to freeze his blood, make his limbs grow stiff and turn him into a motionless, frozen object, and he set off running, fleeing towards his dwelling. The old man, he thought, would have returned during his absence. He had taken another road. He would, no doubt, be sitting before the fire with a dead chamois at his feet. He soon came in sight of the inn, but no smoke rose from it. Ulrich walked faster and opened the door. Sam ran up to him to greet him, but Gaspard Harry had not returned. Kunzi, in his alarm, turned round suddenly, as if he had expected to find his comrade hidden in a corner. Then he relighted the fire and made soup, hoping every moment to see the old man come in. Time to time he went out to see if he were not coming. It was quite night now, that one, the livid night of the mountains, lighted by a thin yellow crescent moon, was disappearing behind the mountain tops. Then the young man went in, sat down to warm his hands and feet, while he pictured to himself every possible accident. Gaspard might have broken a leg, fallen into a crevice, taken a false step, and dislocated his ankle. And perhaps he was lying on the snow, overcome and stiff with the cold, agony of mind, lost and, perhaps, shouting for help, calling with all his might in the silence of the night. Where? The mountain was so vast, so rugged, so dangerous in places, especially at that time of the year. It would have required 10 or 20 guides to walk for a week in all directions to find the man in that immense space. Ulrich Kunzi, however, made up his mind to set out with Sam if Gaspard did not return by 1 in the morning, and he made his preparations. He put provisions for 2 days into a bag, took his steel climbing iron, tied a long, thin, strong rope round his waist, looked to see that his iron-shod stick and his axe, which served to cut steps in the ice, were in order. Fire was burning on their hearth. A great dog was snoring in front of it. The clock was ticking, regularly as a heart beating, its resounding wooden case. He waited with his ears on the alert for distant sounds. He shivered when the wind blew against the roof and the walls. It struck 12 and he trembled. Then, frightened and shivering, he put some water on the fire so that he might have some hot coffee before. When the clock struck 1, he got up, woke Sam, opened the door, and went off in the direction of Wildstrubel. For 5 hours he mounted, scaling the rocks by minute, his climbing irons, cutting into the ice, advancing continually, occasionally hauling up the dog, who remained below at the foot of some slope that was too steep for him, by means of the rope. It was about 6 o'clock when he reached one of the summits, to which old Gaspard often came after chamois. He waited till it should be daylight. The sky was growing pale overhead. The strange light, springing nobody could tell whence, suddenly illuminated the immense ocean of pale mountain summits which extended for 100 leagues around him. One might have said that this vague brightness, the snow itself, had spread abroad in space. By degrees, the highest distant summits assumed a delicate pink flesh color, and the red sun appeared behind the ponderous giants of the Bernese Alps. Ulrich Kuhn set off again, walking like a hunter, bent over, looking for tracks, saying to his dog, "Seek, old fellow, seek." He was descending the mountain now, scanning the depths closely, from time to time shouting, uttering a loud, prolonged cry, which soon died away in that silent vastness. Then he put his ear to the ground to listen, thought he could distinguish a voice, began to run and shouted again. He heard nothing more and sat down, exhausted and in despair. Toward midday he breakfasted, gave Sam, who was as tired as himself, something to eat also. Then he recommenced his search. When evening came, still walking, he had walked more than 30 miles over the mountains. As he was too far away to return home, too tired to drag himself along any further, he dug a hole in the snow, crouched in it with his dog under a blanket which he had brought with him. The man and the dog lay side by side, trying to keep warm, but frozen to the marrow nevertheless. Ulrich scarcely slept, his mind haunted by visions, his limbs shaking with cold. Day was breaking when he got up. His legs were as stiff as iron bars, his spirits so low he was ready to cry with anguish, while his heart was beating so that he almost fell over with agitation when he thought he heard a noise. He imagined that he was also going to die of cold in his vast solitude. The terror of such a death roused his energies, gave him renewed vigor. He was descending toward the inn, following down and getting up again, and followed at a distance by Sam, who was limping on 3 legs, and they did not reach Schwarenbach until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The house was empty. The young man made a fire, had something to eat, to sleep. So worn out he did not think of anything more. He slept for a long time, for a very long time, irresistible sleep. Suddenly a voice, cry, name, Ulrich, roused him from his profound torpor, made him sit up in bed. Had he been dreaming? Those strange appeals which crossed the dreams of disquieted minds? No, he heard it still, reverberating cry which had entered his ears and remained into his flesh, tips of his sinewy fingers. Certainly someone cried out and called Ulrich. Somebody there near the house. There could be no doubt of that. And he opened the door and shouted, "Is it you, Gaspard?" All the strength of his lungs. But there was no reply, no murmur, no groan, nothing. It was quite dark. The snow looked wan. The wind had risen, icy wind that cracks the rocks and leaves nothing alive on those deserted heights. It came in sudden gusts, which were more parching and more deadly than the burning wind of the desert. And again, Rick shouted, "Gaspard! Gaspard! Gaspard!" And then he waited again. Everything was silent on the mountain. Then he shook with terror. With a bound, he was inside the inn. When he shut and bolted the door, then he fell into a chair trembling all over, for he felt certain that his comrade had called him the moment he was expiring. He was sure of that, as sure as one is of being alive or of eating a piece of bread. Old Gaspard Harry had been dying for 2 days and 3 nights somewhere in some hole, one of those deep untrodden ravines, whose whiteness is more sinister than subterranean darkness. He had been dying for 2 days and 3 nights, and he had just then died thinking of his comrade. His soul, almost before it was released, had taken its flight to the inn where Ulrich was sleeping. It had called him by that terrible and mysterious power the spirits of the dead have to haunt the living. That voiceless soul had cried to the worn-out soul of the sleeper, had uttered its last farewell, or its reproach, its curse, on the man who had not searched carefully enough. And Ulrich felt that it was there, quite close to him, behind the wall, behind the door which he had just fastened, was wandering about like a night bird which lightly touches a lighted window with his wings. The terrified young man was ready to scream with horror. He wanted to run away, but did not dare to go out. He did not dare, should never dare to do it in the future, for that phantom would remain there day and night round the inn, as long as the old man's body was not recovered, had not been deposited in the consecrated earth of a churchyard. It was daylight. Kunzi recovered some of his courage at the return of the bright sun, prepared his meal, gave his dog some food, and remained motionless on a chair, tortured at heart as he thought of the old man lying on the snow. And then, as soon as night once more recovered the mountains, new terrors assailed him. He now walked up and down the dark kitchen, which was scarcely lighted by the flame of one candle, walked from one end of it to the other with great strides, listening, listening whether the terrible cry of the other night again break the dreary silence outside. He felt himself alone, unhappy man, as no man had ever been alone before. He was alone in this immense desert of snow, alone 5,000 feet above the inhabited earth, above a human habitation, above that stirring, noisy, palpitating life, alone under an icy sky. Mad longing impelled him to run away, no matter where, to get down to Loki by flinging himself over the precipice. But he did not even dare to open the door, as he felt sure that the other, the dead man, bar his road, so that he might not be obliged to run up there alone. Toward midnight, tired with walking, worn out by grief and fear, he at last fell into a doze in his chair. He was afraid of his bed, as one is of a haunted spot. But suddenly the strident cry of the other evening pierced his ears, and it was so shrill that Ulrich stretched out his arms, repulsed the ghost, fell backward with his chair. Sam, who was awakened by the noise, began to howl as frightened dogs do howl. He walked all about the house, trying to find out where the danger came from. When he got to the door, he sniffed beneath it, smelling vigorously, his coat bristling and his tail stiff, while he growled angrily. Kunzi, who was terrified, jumped up and, holding his chair by one leg, cried, "Don't come in! Don't come in, or I shall kill you!" The dog, excited by this threat, barked angrily at that invisible enemy, defied his master's voice. By degrees, however, he quieted down, came back and stretched himself in front of the fire. But he was uneasy, kept his head up, and growled between his teeth. Ulrich, in turn, recovered his senses, but as he felt faint with terror, he went and got a bottle of brandy out of the sideboard and drank off several glasses, one after another, at a gulp. His ideas became vague, his courage revived, and a feverish glow ran through his veins. He ate scarcely anything the next day, and limited himself to alcohol, and so he lived for several days, like a drunken brute. As soon as he thought of Gaspard Harry, he began to drink again, and went on drinking until he fell to the ground, overcome by intoxication. There he remained, lying on his face, dead drunk, his limbs benumbed, snoring loudly. Scarcely had he digested the maddening and burning liquor than the same cry, "Ulrich!" woke him like a bullet piercing his brain. He got up, still staggering, stretching out his hands to save himself from falling, calling to Sam to help him. The dog, who appeared to be going mad like his master, rushed to the door, scratched with his claws, and gnawed it with his long, white teeth, while the young man, with his head thrown back, drank the brandy in draughts as if it had been cold water, so that it might by and by send his thoughts, his frantic terror, his memory to sleep again. 3 weeks, he had consumed all his stock of ardent spirits, but his continual drunkenness only lulled his terror, which awoke more furiously than ever as soon as it was impossible for him to calm it. His fixed idea, then, had been intensified by a month of drunkenness, which was continually increasing into the absolute solitude, penetrated him like a gimlet. Now walked about the house like a wild beast in its cage, putting his ear to the door to listen if the other were there, defying him to the wall. Then, as he dozed, overcome by fatigue, he heard the voice which made him leap to his feet. At last, one night, as cowards do when driven to extremity, he sprang to the door and opened it, to see who was calling him, and keep quiet. Such a gust of cold wind blew into his face, chilled him to the bone. Closed, bolted the door again immediately, without noticing that Sam had rushed out. Then, as he was shivering with cold, he threw some wood on the fire, and sat down in front of it to warm himself. But suddenly he started, for somebody was scratching at the wall and crying. In desperation he called out, "Go away!" but was answered by another long, sorrowful wail. Then all his remaining senses forsook him from sheer fright. He repeated, "Go away!" and turned round to try to find some corner in which to hide, while the other person went round the house still crying and rubbing against the wall. Ulrich went to the oak sideboard, full of plates and dishes and provisions. Lifting it up with superhuman strength, he dragged it to the door so as to form a barricade. Then, piling up all the rest of the furniture, the mattresses, valises, and chairs, he stopped up the windows as one does when assailed by an enemy. But the person outside now uttered long, plaintive, mournful groans, to which the young man replied by similar groans. Thus days and nights passed without their ceasing to howl at each other. The one was continually walking around the house and scraped the walls, his nails so vigorously it seemed as if he wished to destroy them, while the other, inside, followed all his movements, stooping down and holding his ear to the walls, replying to all his appeals with terrible cries. One evening, however, Ulrich heard nothing more. He sat down, so overcome by fatigue that he went to sleep immediately and awoke in the morning without a thought, without any recollection of what had happened, just as if his head had been emptied during his heavy sleep. But he felt hungry and ate. The winter was over, the Gemai Pass was practicable again, so the Hauser family started off to return to their inn. As soon as they had reached the top of the ascent, the women mounted their mule and spoke about the two men whom they would meet again shortly. They were, indeed, rather surprised that neither of them had come down a few days before, as soon as the road was open, for to tell them about their long winter sojourn. At last, however, they saw the inn, covered with snow like a kilt. The door in the window was closed, a little smoke was coming out of the chimney, reasserted old Hauser. On going up to the door, however, he saw the skeleton of an animal, which had been torn to pieces by the eagles, a large skeleton lying on the side. They all looked close at it, and the mother said, "That must be Sam." Then she shouted, "I, Gaspard." The cry from the interior of the house answered her, a sharp cry that one might thought that uttered it. Old Hauser repeated, "I, Gaspard." They heard another cry similar to the first. Then the three men, the father and the two sons, tried to open the door, but it resisted their efforts. From the empty cow stall they took a beam to serve as a battering ram and hurled it against the door with all their might. The wood gave way, and the boards flew into splinters. Then the house was shaken by a loud voice, and inside, behind the sideboard which was overturned, saw a man standing upright, his hair falling on his shoulders and a beard descending to his breast, shining eyes, and nothing but rags to cover him. They did not recognize him, but Louise Hauser exclaimed, "Is Ulrich, mother?" Her mother declared that it was Ulrich, although his hair was white. He allowed them to go up to him and to touch him, but did not reply to any of their questions. They were obliged to take him to Loki. The doctors found that he was mad. Nobody ever found out what had become of his companion. Little Louise Hauser nearly died that summer of decline, which the physicians attributed to the cold air of the mountains. I fear this is all the time we have for tonight. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe. It would be doing me a great favor. If you want to see me read something of your liking, be sure to send it to me, whether it be fictional or personal. Have a wonderful night.